My name is James Heckman. I'm an economist at the University of Chicago, where I've been for many years, actually. I work on many questions: econometrics, labor economics, economics of education, and most recently looking at the economics of skill development, human capital formation, but more general than the human capital school of past, looking at multiple skills and looking at the development of skills over the life cycle. That's my main theme. It's possible to create data on this question, and the way it's created is by looking at measurements on people, measurements that are taken at various intervals, various frequencies, where you can look at the development of skill, of different kinds of skills. What we've come to understand in the last 50 years of knowledge in psychology and economics and education and many other fields interacting together, neuroscience now increasingly, is that this process of learning, this process of interacting, can be measured. And you can see measurements that are taken in the form of how people express themselves in various ways, the actions they take, the kind of decisions they make under certain conditions, how these people are influenced by other people around them, and by the incentives in situations and in entire groups. But so it's a composite of various fields coming together to understand exactly how it is we behave, these multiple influences, and then more basically to understand who we are. Who are we as people? How do we evolve? Who are we? Are we just a social reflection of everything around us? Are we just simply a cipher that kind of coasts along the sea, the ocean waves, carry us any which way? Or to what extent do we have deep values or deep sets of skills and convictions? And how do those change? How can those be altered? How can they be perverted? How can they be incentivized to create lives that are more satisfactory for the people living them? And so it's partly a question of identity, what kind of identities we form, how we change those identities, and how we learn about our own selves and about the identity of others, and then how we represent each other and exchange and engage each other in groups. So the economics of human, sounding like human flourishing is all human knowledge, maybe too vast, but it is vast, and it does involve all of these elements. Traditionally, it's been the study of a single person, understanding how that person develops, say, an IQ or develops a kind of trait of some sort. But what we've come to understand is that it's much more than IQ. Intelligence is just part of the story. The old notion that IQ was somehow genetically determined and fixed at birth has long been challenged, and we've come to understand the role of experience, the role of all kinds of interactions, imitation from the work of others, also understanding and trying to emulate those we admire, and then maybe after emulating, gaining disappointment and realizing they're false gods or this is a false trail. It's that process of becoming. So it's the process, it's learning. Human flourishing is the process of really becoming and becoming even more aware of ourselves and doing something with what we're aware of. Generally speaking, the contrast that's been made, and Angela Duckworth, who's a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania, and I helped popularize this distinction in an article we wrote together about 15 or 20 years ago. And what we were trying to distinguish was exactly the distinction between what's tested in something like a PISA test or an SAT or even an IQ test from the other dimensions of human performance. And it was that distinction we were making. So we were referring to a set of cognitive tests and saying that there are other aspects of human behavior and human flourishing and human success which are not captured by those tests. And so but the whole idea of the test, I think, becoming a central aspect of Western culture, and for that matter now cultures around the world, starts here in France, starts here in Paris, I think, with Binet, who was a famous psychologist who invented a version of the IQ test. And the Americans took this IQ test and applied it in a very large scale in 1915 or 1916 when we started constructing a draft to try to determine who was eligible, which men were eligible, or which ones were not, were mentally feeble. And so the idea of IQ was recent. It's only 20 years old at most. And it's been perfected only in the last maybe 100 years. And it's become something almost reified. And the reason why I say it's reified, if you look at the early pioneers of education, like I mentioned Horace Mann in much of my work. Horace Mann was a very thoughtful individual. He developed the concept of the common school in the United States to develop a framework, a format for developing a national identity, a common language, a common sense of national purpose. But he talked about the fact that at the time, this is in the 1840s when he was doing this work, he talked that there was this big pressure to have something like tests. There was no Hollerith equipment, there was no machine screening techniques, all those came later. But he resisted it. And his famous quote, which I think is really worth repeating and repeating again, is that reading, writing, and arithmetic is the least of what we teach in school. That what we're teaching is really a way to reason with each other, to engage, to motivate ourselves, to guide ourselves, to control our passions, and to work with others. And that has been a recurring theme. And in fact, even when the tests were developed, so the IQ test came in, Americans went crazy with the IQ test. So for example, starting in the 1920s and early 30s, the Educational Testing Service started putting out the SAT, Scholastic Aptitude Test. And that was designed not as an IQ test, although it's closely related to IQ, but it's related as a test of achievement, understanding what people knew. So the idea was to give people opportunity. Children who were not from very rich environments, or maybe not, but who had some fundamental ability, who might easily be overlooked. And that was partly a response to the college admission system of that time, which was a lot of family connections, legacy in legacy kinds of admissions to Harvard and to Yale and to the elite schools. So the SAT was allegedly a test. It was designed to filter out smart people, and it did serve that purpose. Places like Harvard and Yale democratized their enrollment, even then, starting from this kind of enrollment. So it did at least recognize a part of what cognitive ability was about. But there was a more pernicious aspect to the IQ test. And this is something that's been studied by a psychologist, actually, at NYU named Clancy Blair. And he's pointed out something that is really kind of unconscious. IQ was so powerful that it started permeating the way that educational curriculum was constructed. So that starting from the 1920s, you can see an emphasis more and more on abstract cognition in what was examined, what the textbook lessons were about, and even what the meaning of who was good, who was bad, what schools, who should go to school, who shouldn't. IQ at that time was viewed as a sorting mechanism. There were people who were viewed as idiots. They literally were called idiots. People who were in various stages. They had imbeciles, idiots, and various other categories, all obsolete now, but based on the IQ. And the idea is you sort people. So there was some notion that some people can't be trained. Their IQs are just so low they can't learn. Others are smart, they're medium, they should be manual laborers, but can't go further. So there was a sense of IQ stratification. It became very much part of the curriculum of schools. Schools were teaching and sorting people on the basis of what they thought the IQs were. Until the 1950s and early 60s, England had this 11+ system, where at age 11 you took an exam, a cognitive exam, an achievement test so-called, and if you failed it, you were routed into manual trades, you didn't go on to university, and so forth. So the view was that these things, these traits, they were called traits, were fixed. And so this cognition became very powerful. And then in the 1960s, a psychologist who recently just died, named Brunner, who was at Harvard in psychology, developed very far this notion of cognitive psychology. And cognition was all about learning about mathematics, reading, writing. And we know that language and mathematics and logic, these are all important, so we're not denying that. But the focus became almost exclusively on that. And then in America, what happened was also something very interesting. Because some of these other, quote, softer skills were taught usually within a religious format. So, for example, one of the lessons, I don't know if you've ever looked at something called the McGuffey's Reader in the United States. It was very popular in the 1890s. What you saw in the McGuffey's Reader were these stories that were more or less patterned after Aesop's fables, and they were patterned after stories in the Bible, and they were tales of morality. And these were part of the lessons that children learned. But that became somehow associated with Protestant Christianity. And then there was a whole movement afoot because the United States became more diverse. You know, there were Catholics admitted, and they didn't like Protestant theology. Jews were admitted. And then groups from Asia and others did not like the emphasis on what they thought was Christian morality. And so the whole question of morality got eliminated. But with it, a notion of teaching character and teaching people these skills of perseverance and working it together. So John Dewey, who was a precursor of mine at the University of Chicago, later went to Columbia, when he formed his lab school, and a crucial part of it was actually teaching children how to interact with each other, also even doing things like making gardens and working with each other collaboratively, and teaching a range of skills. That all got filtered out. And I think one thing that economists did in this whole business of human flourishing and then adding to the understanding of these non-cognitive skills was showing in a way that the educational psychologists hadn't shown how predictive these skills were in life outcomes. We're talking about earnings, occupation, marriage stability. We're talking about divorce, crime, a number of ranges of human activity, which we all view as important components. And so capturing these dimensions really creates a new frontier of understanding about how, but also creates a challenge, which is that many people use the term soft skills because they can't be measured. That's the claim. But that's just not true, too. We've learned now increasingly that we can measure those skills. The World Bank and many other international organizations have developed tools to have ways to measure these. And the measurements are not all just paper and pencil tests, not at all. They're not even self-reports. They're teacher reports, they're school records from administrative behavior, pieces of information, social media, things that provide a kind of whole perspective on the person and the person engaging with society. But it's these aspects, these attributes about perseverance and so forth that were neglected, and we've come to understand that just like Horace Mann said, we are teaching those lessons in schools. We're teaching them in families. We're teaching them in social groups. Our peer networks teach us those things. And the fact that we're able to now have much better mechanisms for measuring them means that when we think about education broadly, I mean, not just bricks and mortar schools, but education that's learning on the job, education that's preschool, the home learning, and so forth. All of those traits, all of those kinds of activities, I should say, are really things that can be measured now. And it's very exciting. We're engaged in a new project. I'm talking about a community of psychologists. I work with a lot of psychologists now, and we're engaged in these new measurements about trying to understand what skills are important. As a practical project, we have an NSF project looking at STEM. Who's participating in STEM, science, technology, and engineering and mathematics learning? And what are the skills that engage that? And they involve social and emotional skills, the ability to stay on problems, the ability to persevere, the ability to accept failure and to learn from it. Because one of the things we've learned about is IQ isn't just fixed. IQ can be affected. IQ can be uplifted. We've seen that. So even on the narrow cognitive measurements, the old eugenics approach has definitely been discredited. We can see sustained gains in IQ. I followed these for like 50, 60 years now over the lives of children. So we can sustain that kind of development. But we can also see other aspects have been equally important, like what keeps a person healthy at age 50, at age 35. It's partly the practices, the amount of self-control people have, the ability to listen to medical advice, to digest it, to act on it. And those are traits of perseverance. Those are traits of conscientiousness, traits that are acquired. Things, we shouldn't even call them traits anymore because traits is an archaic notion about skills being fixed. Almost everything we have can be varied. Now, there's some musical ability. I mean, a Mozart, I don't think we can train a Mozart in a preschool. I mean, it's not that we're going to create genius. But we can definitely encourage even a Mozart And we may well discover Mozarts if we expand education opportunities enough to allow children to flourish in the ways they have their strengths. Many countries have now been adopting notions of non-cognitive skill. As I say before, the structure of this knowledge is fluid. We're learning about it. And so in many cases, and this is a danger when these programs become too bureaucratized, they become too formal, that people have taken the knowledge of these social and emotional skills, and now there's a whole exercise, at least in the United States. Many schools have adopted this notion under the encouragement not only of school boards and governing boards, but also parental initiatives of what's called social and emotional learning. But some of this is very stylized. And there are groups of people, I mean, always involved in here, you have people trying to make some money. So you have people pushing a product, and they sell the product, and usually they oversell the product. But there is a group that, and I don't want to criticize any particular group, but there's a sense that there's a curriculum for social and emotional learning. And that's one of the dangers about education right now. And the danger that is that people say, okay, here we have these social skills, so I want to teach a class on social skills. That's the traditional educator's response. They say, yes, they're important. I understand. We can see it. So I want to have a class. But again, it neglects the idea that was going on back in Horace Mann's mind, that literally so much of learning involves multiple skills simultaneously. Like when a mother shows affection for her child at a very young infant and kind of lets the child know how much the child's loved, and then lets the child explore. And then when the child explores, sometimes makes a mistake or fails, but it tells the child, well, that's not the end of the world, try again. It's that kind of encouragement. It does multiple things. It teaches the child to learn that particular task. But it also is creating a set of examples and remember, we imitate. So we're also seeing how our parents and our peers and our environments treat us. So it's not like we have a class. So one thing I found that's amazing, I personally am amazed by it. I'm deeply fascinated by this. And that is the value. I spent a lot of time worrying about early childhood activities. Well, I've come to ask, well, what do we know about early childhood? There are many programs now. I've evaluated many of these programs. I've done benefit cost analyses. I followed people up to age 60, in one case in a Perry study that I had done, recently published. But what we've also done is we've also looked more deeply into these studies. And we said, how is it these programs work? So it's like a shotgun. People are saying, oh, you need a teacher certification, you need a clean classroom, you need a computer, you need a psychologist, you need a whole list. You see a checklist on the wall and say, we must do this. But what we've really come to understand is the most important aspect of this social and emotional learning, and learning itself, is this kind of interpersonal interaction with warmth. What a famous psychologist, a Russian psychologist, Vygotsky, called scaffolding. And it was the sense that you would take a child to the next level. It's personalized education now, we call it that. But it's more than just taking a particular skill and saying, okay, now you can prove the Pythagorean theorem, now you can go one step further. That's part of it. That's an aspect of scaffolding. But it also takes the child at the child's emotional and logical and cognitive level and moves the child forward one step, one small step, just so the child isn't discouraged, and then finds where the child is, and you scaffold. It's almost like Pygmalion, building a statue that comes to life. This is a child that comes to life. And so what we do is we find that kind of human interaction, provided in a warm and supportive way that allows experimentation, fosters growth, and it also fosters a whole set of these other experiences. So one thing that's very important, I think, is that we've forgotten, I'm talking collectively in a body of scholars, is that the importance of failing. I was once in a meeting with Jack Ma years ago in Chicago, and he said, I have a university at my company, Alibaba, at the time, Alibaba, and he said, what I do is I teach people how to fail. Everybody looked around. What do you mean, teach people how to fail? What he meant is have the courage to try something new. And if it failed, it would fail. Most everything fails initially. Almost everything is a bad start. Maybe it's a beginning, but not. But what you want to do is make sure they don't quit. And that's really important with children, that they don't quit. But you do that in a way of providing a supportive environment, but not an overly protective environment either. Because if you have the so-called helicopter parent, which makes sure the child is never wrong, the child always gets the right answer, you do the child's homework for the child, the child's always successful, but the child never grows, that's equally stifling. So what you need to do, and this is what we've learned, is there are multiple lessons. So there isn't a lesson on how to be, and that was what probably the mistake was in the earlier McGuffey's Reader days. They'd read Aesop's fables, and they would teach morality in that way. But what we really know is how to emulate successful lives. And so the idea that there's a class on grit, and there are these people, there's a whole group of people, a group of very serious and sincere individuals who believe they have interventions on grit, on perseverance, on this, that, and the other thing. And they miss something. And I think they miss something really important. And now I'm taking you to the edge. And I can tell you, I could bring in people to sit in this chair and tell you that I'm dead wrong. But I'm telling you, I think they need to understand that it's this multiplicity, this cross-learning, that is really what is important, what's going on in school. And so they're thinking of schooling as a holistic process rather than as somehow a process that's teaching you how to do this subject or that subject in a way that's detached. I mean, even the way the teachers are interacting with the children plays a vital role in understanding how to form those social and emotional skills. So I think it's that kind of learning that represents the interactive property. But this is starting to be understood. Learning is interrelated. And psychologists get at this. There's a whole book by a whole woman, a book written by a female psychologist. I think she's at NYU. And I think it's Elizabeth Phelps, I believe is her name. But she talks about the emotional basis of learning. And literally, when a child's frightened to death, when you're in an environment that's hostile, you can't experiment, you can't flourish. And in that sense, really understanding the emotional conditions of learning as well as the cognitive conditions and the technology and the pedagogy, all of those are very much interrelated, but they must come together. But actually, here in Paris, you have a very distinguished scholar, Stanislas Dehaene. I don't know if you know his work, but he's excellent. He's brilliant. And he's done a lot of work on the neuroscience of learning. And he's again suggested the ways we might improve learning. And again, it comes back, I think, to this notion of experimentation and thinking much more broadly about education and reading and learning these things through doing a range of activities rather than specializing. So